Hey everyone, welcome. I'm first going to introduce the panelists to the stage, and then I'm going to say a few words about a report that E3G has just published on the exact topic that we're going to talk about. And then we're going to have a panel followed by some Q&A. So firstly, I would like to introduce Rhian-Marie Thomas, the CEO of the UK Green Finance Institute.
On the end.
Secondly, Mafalda Duarte, the Executive Director of the Green Climate Fund. Thirdly, Shahjahan Mirza, the Managing Director of the Private Power Infrastructure Board and the CEO of Alternate Energy Development Board, Pakistan.
Thank you.
And Dr. Vera Rodenhoff, the Deputy Director General for the German Ministry for Economy and Energy. And you'll notice that we are currently missing Tatiana Rosito from the Brazilian Finance Ministry. Tatiana will be joining us shortly. She's just delayed at another engagement, but she'll be here and she'll speak on the panel as planned. So we're delighted to have her too when she gets here. She'll probably just come on, so please don't break out into applause as she takes a seat on the stage if someone else is talking. We'll save that to the end. So we're here today to talk about the significance of finance for meeting the challenge of climate change, both in terms of the impacts of climate change and its mitigation. We just followed on from a panel on the energy transition. We will focus a little bit today on the energy financing challenge in emerging markets, but we do welcome the panelists to talk about other financing challenges too. Lots of conversations on that across London Climate Action Week, both the event at Kew Gardens, as we're speaking now, talking about forest financing, and then the Resilience Summit on Friday. Across London, CPI are also publishing a report on the state of play of climate finance through their landscape review. They've given us a little bit of frustration at us scheduling this event at the same time because they're very synergistic. But what that did show is that for the first time, total climate finance in developing countries has climbed to over $1 trillion per year, 196 billion of which is investment into developing country economies. In parallel, last night, E3G published a report that set out our view on the different measures that we need to undertake in order to reach the financing challenge and reach the goal that was agreed at COP29 in Baku to mobilize $1.3 trillion in climate finance to developing countries by 2035. It's been a very challenging time for climate and development since then. Things that we have lots of experts on the panel to share their opinions of. But what it has made clear is that we need to undertake a very integrated approach to coming at that challenge using all of the tools that we have in our arsenal. And so what we've set out in the report is a composite of the different aspects of climate finance, ranging from structural reforms that we need to create the fiscal space that's needed for developing countries to be able to act, right the way through to the regulatory barriers that are holding back climate investment, so things like building climate risk into financial frameworks, working with credit rating agencies to understand how risk affects emerging markets, and better providing data to the private sector so that they can undertake investment. We also talk a little bit around how we can make the whole climate finance architecture work better. So I think we've heard a lot, well, as we've said in a few panels over the course of today, we've gone from a world in which we need to make the system more efficient to a world in which we need to do more with less. And that's unfortunate, but there are a lot of things that we can do. So we know that we're pouring a lot of money into funds that are producing lots of similar things. We know that the system can work together. We know that there are tools that we have that we're not using as well as we can, and we're not working as well together as we can. And we'll get into some of that on the panel today, but we also encourage you to look at the report and some of our suggestions there. We also talk about the role of the development sector and that it needs to move from a primarily serving as a lender and investor to one that does much more to absorb risk and act as a catalyst. So how do we actually get the development banks and development finance and the role of guarantees and the role of asset recycling mechanisms to do more with less and to get more money flowing? Finally, we talk about the need to rebuild political leadership and investment in international support. So we've seen lots of unfortunate cuts to development budgets for lots of different reasons in the context of populism and also in the context of fiscal constraint. That's come at a very difficult time when we were already facing a very difficult investment challenge. So whilst we are doing all of these structural things, whilst we can do things to do more with less, we also need to get more into the system. And there are lots of proposals on how to do that, but they all start with political courage. And as we see lots of countries considering spending 5% of their GDP on security, how do we make sure we're also spending money on some of the key enablers of long-term security, which include avoiding the worst impacts of climate change and building shared prosperity and the clean economy of the future? And finally, we talk about the need to make sure that the multilateral climate finance architecture is effective in terms of its diplomatic impact. So how do we go from a world in which we get lots of people rolling their eyes at yet another finance discussion at a COP and yet another forum where things are being discussed? How do we actually make those impactful and fit for purpose? So we encourage you to read all of those, and that'll give our take. But we're here today to hear the views of the panel. So I'm going to start with Rhian-Marie, and I am just going to sit down before I ask this question because this feels slightly weird. So I'll start with Rhian-Marie. So there's lots of talk in the international community around how to do more with less, as we've just heard, including by us, it appears. What can we do to make sure that public finance is more effective in mobilizing the private sector? So GFI has been working on this in some time, both internationally and a very long time in the UK context. What are the main transferable lessons that you've learned to date, and what would you point us at?
That's a great question. Firstly, thank you so much to E3G, not only for inviting me to speak today, but for your leadership in setting up London Climate Action Week, which has obviously become such an important milestone in the annual calendar of events. So huge congratulations to you and your leadership. Wherever we look, we see government balance sheets very constrained. I love the point you made just now about how do we get to 5% for emissions, not just for munitions. And one of the things that we do need to be looking at more carefully is, one, how do we actually, I'm going to die on the hill of saying guarantees, not grants. I've been saying it for 6 years. I'm going to keep saying it. But one of the challenges to actually using government balance sheet in more creative and innovative ways is the fact that the few people who know how to create capital stacks, to actually pull together government money, philanthropic money, different types of private sector capital, tend to work in one place and one place alone, and that is in the city or in the Wall Street. And actually figuring out how do we get that talent, how do we actually make sure that we've got counterparties at the other side of the table, people sitting in government positions, sitting in think tanks, sitting in foundations that genuinely don't just understand the macroeconomic challenges that we're looking, but know how to actually do a deal, know how to actually mobilize capital, how to build a capital stack, how to actually meet that execution gap that you see between big government ambitious statements, big political statements of intent, national determined contributions that set the direction, but are quite often uninvestable from a private capital perspective. How do we bridge that execution gap with the finance sector, who's full of very smart people, but for all that smart, so has never actually figured out how to mobilize capital other than between two counterparties? The finance sector works in deals. The political sector works in systems, in long-term commitments. And one of the points that Rob and I, we were discussing earlier is the jeopardy and the peril that climate breakdown and nature depletion presents to us means that it's absolutely right that we should try every single strategy to mobilize more capital towards these outcomes. But it is also right for us to maybe take a look at some of these strategies that we've been using and do a bit of a stock take and go, what is working and what is not working quite so well? And one of the things I think that has raised the bar, it's elevated the dialogue, but perhaps isn't resulting in the mobilization of capital in the way we would like to see it, is the application of political processes to financial institutions. And what I mean by that is it's completely reasonable in a political context to set a long-term commitment without an immediate implementation plan of how to get there. That's how you shift the Overton window. That's how you get the population to agree and buy into ideas that would have seemed outlandish just a few years ago. That is not how the markets work. It's not how finance works. You don't announce the deal until you've actually signed your term sheet. So maybe now is the time for us to actually flip that on its head and go, how do we bring financial deal-doing discipline into policy? And so how do we actually use financial acumen, creativity of the financial sector to go into the policymakers and say, I'm not here to talk about enabling conditions writ large. I'm not here to talk about how the finance sector as a whole can be greened. I'm talking about how finance can can be a facilitator for some of the projects that we need to see financed. And these are the very specific regulations that we need change. These are the very specific legislation that we need to see change, because then we've got a whole row of, not the laggards, but the people who are at the vanguard who actually want to put their money to work, who would be willing to do so. I'll leave it there, but hopefully we'll come back to some of those points.
I will ask a follow-up first. So you're working, I think, very closely with the UK government's Global Clean Power Alliance with how to bring private finance to emerging market country platforms. And country platforms, I think this is the longest I've gone at a finance event where we haven't said country platforms, but I've now broken that 10 minutes in. But country platforms can both be transactional but also draw on country plans. So I wondered if you could just talk about the opportunity you see there for them increasing coherence and building confidence for private investment. Do you see them as something that will genuinely be impactful, and how do we make them so if there is potential there?
Well, Rob, I think you've teed me up to make an announcement, which is always good in London Climate Action Week.
It's also unintentional. Let's see where this goes.
So we're delighted that both Brazil and the UK government have asked the Green Finance Institute to co-lead with the World Bank on how we're going to look specifically at making sure in the clean energy space that we are aligning the platforms, the plans, and the projects so that they are private finance ready. Starting, I think immediately, we're going to be working, well, we're working with government on the plans to, in the first instance, in the run-up to COP in Belém, to pull together a green print. I think they're calling it blueprint, so that will be the first negotiation point. Pull together a green print of, how do we mobilize capital into emerging markets and developing economies? We've seen, as I said, we've seen lots of things that are working well. Mafalda, I'm sure, will highlight a few of those opportunities. But, one, what are the key learnings from those things? How do we create a playbook? And then, that'll be just the start. It's then going to be what's the support offer for the various country platforms to make sure that the work that they're doing, the energy planning that they're doing, is energy planning that works for private finance, which has to be the goal. And then, obviously, we would hope to move on from there to the area that I'd like to think the Green Finance Institute is particularly adept at, which is co-designing with the markets and with the governments, with the country platforms locally, the actual financial mechanisms, the right governance, the right financial institutions to enable that capital to be deployed. And the one thing that we will be emphasizing throughout is we need to talk about supply of capital. This is obviously about cost of capital, making sure that you've got your capital stack designed in such a way that the capital is competitively priced. But we really, really need to speak about demand, about the vehicles that will deploy the capital, about the bankability of the projects coming through. It's no good just talking about supply, you've got to do both. So I'm very much looking forward to working with government, and I think we'll be making a more formal announcement during the course of the week. So thanks, Rob.
Great. I'm glad to have inadvertently teed you up, but that responds to a common refrain that we've heard around the need to do that work up front so that when these plans are created, they are ready. So we're going to move on to Mafalda. So Mafalda, you're now at the Green Climate Fund, having previously spent a lot of time at the Climate Investment Funds. And the GCF being the world's biggest climate fund, present everywhere at the epicenter of almost every aspect of the climate finance architecture in some way, shape, or form, and therefore is seen often, I think, as synonymous with some of the challenges that are facing the climate finance architecture. So I wondered if you could talk about, from what you're hearing, there's a lot of attention, certainly at a political level, and certainly in the COP negotiations on the recent development budget cuts. And that's created a sort of sense of scarcity and a sense of having to do even more with what we've got. How are you seeing both the GCF and sort of your client countries respond to that? And what do you think should be the way forward in terms of some of the concerns we have over the pathway forward to scale finance for climate?
Thank you very much, and a pleasure to be here with all of you in this beautiful building and beautiful weather in London. So let me start by saying that we are in very challenging geopolitical times, we all know. And as you've mentioned, we are seeing cuts, ODA cuts that also reach the climate agenda as well. Welcome, Tatiana. And this is happening at exactly the same time as the science is telling us So recently, not that long ago, a few days ago, there was another article saying 60 of the top scientists warning us that we have 3 years of the current carbon budget. What does it mean? That if we want to get 1.5, and with the emissions that we have on an annual basis, we can only sustain 3 more years like this. And we also know that last year we surpassed 1.5 for the first time. So that's the conundrum and the paradox of the geopolitical times, is that on the one hand, we are seeing cuts when the agenda is as important as it has ever been. And to actually invest is more critical than ever. Because it touches on many of the things that we talk about these days when we are talking about geopolitical challenges: security, migration. So all of those, food security, energy security, water security, the climate agenda touches on all of these. And then, of course, the title is $1.3 trillion, which is related to the NCQG, of course. And we also have to understand, and again, I mean, I've said this a few times, it's difficult to get many people to understand we have to invest in developing countries. Because if we don't invest in developing countries, which is where most of the energy consumption is, where most of the population is, where most of the GDP is, where the most significant infrastructure gap is, and that is locked into carbon, high carbon intensive infrastructure, we are locking in investments for 40 years. So I think that's, I think it's always important to keep coming back to this point precisely because of the geopolitical times that we are in. So it is happening at the same time. And interestingly, what I also observe is that from the public opinion in many places, this is acceptable. And why is that? Because at the same time, we keep discussing this issue of how the system is not fit for purpose, and how the climate finance architecture is not fit for purpose. And there's a lot of wastage in the system, and there's a lot of inefficiency in the system. And that's true as well, that we have to reform the system, and I'll come to what we are doing in GCF, and there is ample space for the institutions to become more efficient, and for us to be much more responsive as a system to the challenges of developing countries. But we have to do both. We have to fix that and raise the ambition on the finance. It's not allowing the argument that because it's not efficient, we are lowering the ambition. So with that, so you're coming to the Green Climate Fund. We took on this challenge. So we set, in 2023, we said, this mechanism, because of its centrality in the system, because it's basically a catalyst and enabler of the private, and just to give a sense, we have more than 130 entities we work with, from governments to MDBs to other IFIs to private sector. So we basically said we need a fund that is fit for purpose, efficient, focusing on the most impactful things, and equipping the organization basically to deliver much larger scales, because that's what the system needs. We need several of the institutions to be thinking hard, how do we equip the organizations to be able to deliver at a very different level of efficiency and the greatest impact. So, I mean, Rian was talking about private sector. This is a space that GCF is also very unique in this system or architecture, as we call it, because we do deals directly with private sector and different types of private sector, from equity funds to commercial banks. And so we have been operating in 3 main vectors in terms of mobilizing private sector capital. Is domestic capital, creating new relevant financial institutions, for example. Creating new green businesses or enabling businesses to grow through our equity portfolio. We have a very significant equity portfolio, $2 billion. And then the institutional capital as well. A lot of conversation around unlocking institutional capital. So as an example, listed here in the London Stock Exchange, the Green Guarantee Company. This is a financial institution to enable the issuance of green bonds in developing countries. And our goal is we have dedicated efforts and are exploring many other structures, partnerships that can really unlock a different quantum of investment using what is a very unique capital that we are managing because it's public capital, but the most flexible that it actually exists. And we are working at the same time in the this efficiency agenda. So we have already achieved significant gains in terms of processing, making sure that the processes are more efficient, the project review, the disbursement, the flow of resources to the projects, and hope that we can be an example to others as well through what we are doing.
Great, thank you. And just very briefly as a follow-up, so when you were at the CIFS, you also played a really big role in driving forward over a long time. It took many years to agree. The Clean Technology Fund's capital markets mechanism, which is also listed here in London along with the Green Guarantee Group. How scalable do you see that model? Is it something that can be replicated elsewhere? We're also seeing a lot of proposals from the MDBs, including the Inter-American Development Bank, to do more in terms of asset recycling. There's a big push to use more to bring investment forward, especially for energy. And I just wondered if you could briefly touch on that and if you see that as having scale potential.
I mean, that is one, yes, as you said, it took a long time. It took longer than it should have taken for various reasons. But, it's part of, now, as you said, other efforts, similar efforts, is this question which policymakers, politicians, and others keep coming back to. How do you make the most with the capital you have? How do you manage effectively the finances that you have? And I think, this is also the topic of the MDB reform. How do we unlock more investments by managing those balance sheets more efficiently? So it's part of the same premise. In some cases, some approaches will work better. In other cases, other approaches will work better. We will explore what are the relevant approaches for the Green Climate Fund in the understanding that, MDBs are different, the Climate Investment Funds is different, GCF has its own mandate and portfolio as well. But I think the key premise is that we should take on the responsibility to assess, are we managing these resources in the most efficient way possible? And if not, what is it else that we need to do? Because every dollar counts. We are running against time. So I come back to the urgency of the problem. Every dollar counts.
Yeah, I think we're hearing that more and more. We were already hearing it a lot, but we're hearing it more and more. So I'm going to turn next to Shahjahan to bring in a perspective from those actually trying to attract finance for national action in their sort of own economy. So Pakistan's made enormous progress on clean energy deployment in recent years. You've got a target for 60% of renewables by 2030. And a lot of your job is trying to attract private finance for that, and we'll get to that in a moment. But firstly, it would be good to just hear from you how important in the current context international public finance is for scaling down fossil fuel use, and how you see the best use of that within your context.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Actually, the Pakistan government in the mid-1990s decided that we are not going to put in any more public fund into the power generation sector. So the government still stands by that, and the result is that today over 62% of our power generation capacity is in the private sector. And the public sector only owns the large hydro dam where water storage is required and the hydropower is associated, and some of the nuclear power generation we have. So government has stood by that. In terms of attracting investment and what we are looking here, the target of $1.3 trillion, I think we talk about the government guarantees and we talk about the government concession. I think this is a very common limited recourse financing model on which Pakistan has worked, that government of Pakistan is giving sovereign guarantee in case of default by the power purchaser, or in case of default by the service buyer, which is sometimes power purchaser, sometimes it is the transmission line utility. So we are still working with that model. But the success is, if we look at, we have always been talking about with this 1.3 trillion about the external and international sources of financing. But one, I think, unique example which Pakistan has that is without any international commitment is that today we have over 6 gigawatt of solar PV installed on the rooftop. This is the solar system installed by the general consumers of electricity. And that is because of the government incentive and the policy, because government has given a very good rate that if you daytime you sell to the utility, the rates are very good. So that I put a lot of incentive for the consumers to put in the money. So I think the emphasis comes in on this thing that if we put the policy perspective and the incentive right, we can probably generate a lot of investment through local and domestic resources, even not the commercial and the banking resources. We're just talking about the general consumer and the domestic resources, where they see that they're saving rather than putting into the bank or some saving certificates. They can actually put in their investment into the clean energy, and which is adding a lot to the grid. So the result is that officially the grid connected large utility scale renewable energy, we have only 35%. But this is another 14 to 15% which has been added to the grid without any government guarantee, without any major lending from the bank and all those things. The only thing government has facilitated, one is the rate at which government buys this excess electricity is very good. And the Central Bank of Pakistan, they gave some scheme for some sort of concessional financing for this thing. So I think that's probably the model which other countries can also follow to bring into the renewable energy. But the major question remains that the renewable energy, and these are all mitigation measures, I think attracting investment is more difficult on the adaptation side, where the investment is long-term, returns are not very good, and probably the risk factors are high. So we need to do more focus on the mitigation side compared to, through the adaptation side compared to the mitigation side, on which probably we have the instrument, we have partial risk guarantees by the MDBs, we have other instruments which can compensate for that. So I think that's what, if I wrap up in Pakistan, that how we have been able to bring in. And government is still committed to take this 35%, rather 45% to 60%, and for that we are attracting the private investment. We are not putting any money from the public exchequer. You know, I mean, all the developing and emerging economies, they are always constrained with the money for the development. So that's the way we are looking at it.
It's a really powerful success story, and just I wondered if you could just elaborate perhaps on one, if you were to pick one thing that you see as absolutely critical for success in attracting private finance to a sort of a developing economy with a really ambitious decarbonization agenda, what would you pull it out as being?
I think it's really difficult to say one critical factor, but as we work with the banks and the financing institutions, I think what made Pakistan success, if we talk in terms of international financing, I think there are a couple of things. There's more than one thing. One is the sovereign guarantee, which government is now trying to actually leave the sovereign guarantees and move more towards the commercial guarantees. And the second thing I would say is the trust. We in all these long-term contexts, we have international arbitration provision there. So if there's something dispute or something that goes to the international arbitration, that is another fraction. Then there are some fiscal concessions in terms of exemption or reduced income tax, reduced import duties, reduced custom duties. So this is actually a combination of that. And one, if I may quote, and one major factor is my own organization, Private Power and Infrastructure Board. When Pakistan in 1990s decided to bring in the investment into the power sector, private investment into the power sector, that was a very new thing, a new sector for investment. So the government decided that we should have a dedicated body as a one-window facility, rather than these investors moving from one ministry and one department to another department. So that has been very successful, as I said earlier. We have over 62% of power generation capacity in the private sector. We have some transmission line in the private sector also on the build to own operate BOT basis, and we want to try more transmission line into the private sector now, because as most of us know, that bringing in more renewable energy and integrating it into the system is actually the major challenge is the grid. You have to have a very strong and robust grid which actually can handle the intermittency of the renewable energy and its variation, seasonal and daily variation. So that is the area now where we want to work, and we are working with some of the MDBs as well, actually, to look into the revision of the policy, that how we can make this policy more attractive so that we can get long-term investment into that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. So, again, just a really, really powerful example, and I think something that sort of wider system links of thinking about if we can do more to decarbonize the power sector through local action, private investment, and provide the right support for that, that will free up more of those scarce capital for things that we really need it for, like adaptation. And that's a common refrain that we're hearing across the week. So I'm going to turn to Vera. And so Vera, Germany has historically played a really big role in the sort of climate finance and climate finance diplomacy space. So I remember being in the UK government, thinking in both as presidency and in working in the climate finance team. Germany was always very much behind the big drives to convene country donors and sort of bring them forward. We're moving into a slightly more pluralistic context where there's lots of drivers of climate finance, lots of ways of mobilizing money. How are you guys thinking about adapting your strategy in the current context? And obviously, you're under a relatively recent government change, so we don't expect you to have all of the answers. But maybe you could just say a few words about the initiatives that you are working on.
Yeah, thank you. And we are indeed, I think our government started, or the Chancellor was sworn in on the 5th of May. So it's fairly recent. We do have a coalition treaty, first of all, and that says and reinstates that Germany is willing to pay its fair share of climate finance, and that there will be always climate finance. There has to be a core of public finance, and so in the coalition, we set that down. By the way, along with, we're going to stick to our net zero by 2045, and we're committed to the energy transition. So in spite of everything that's going on in the world and the recent elections, so we're sticking to that. And 2023, we had 6.5 billion finance from public only, and then mobilized 10 billion of climate finance. So, but yes, there is scarcity because other needs need to be met. So what do we do? So we're going to look, obviously, strategically at where can we make the most impact. And this is an ongoing exercise now, obviously. It's just starting. We're just getting organized with our ministry. Where can we make the most impact with our finances? Where also can we coordinate with other donors so we don't all go into the same space, overburdening some of our partners with that. So these are the things we need to do, work together. Then, obviously, we are committed to doubling adaptation finance, and we just heard, obviously, it's more difficult to attract private financing to the adaptation side of things, but also this is a question of perspective. If you look in the long term, if you look at the insurance risks, if you look at really what you can save on the budgets, if you take a different perspective, there's also a different perspective on adaptation. But of course, we can see that there are areas, and you just mentioned it, in mitigation where private finance is going to go if we can be catalytic about our financing. So we really need to address the barriers, and we have to look at the instruments with which we can do that. So one instrument that we've looked at fairly recently is green guarantees, to take off the risk of finance going into mostly the developing countries where it should be going, where the money is there, the investors are just not going to the global south, if you still want to call it that. So what can we do? We'd want to address the real and perceived risks. Now, one thing, just in response, one thing that needs to be there, obviously, are the enabling conditions. And So just also in response to Rihanna Marie, this is government work. We partner with countries on the enabling conditions. They do have to be right. But if we are getting the enabling conditions right more and more, then why still isn't private finance going there? And the Green Guarantee Group, which we kicked off, will actually, it's a work of experts. There's a wise persons group also, and we have developed with this wise persons group some recommendations which will be presented next week at the Financing for Development Summit in Sevilla. So I can't really go into it because it would be a little bit of a sneak preview. Are some aspects that we do want to address there is taking a more methodological approach. There are certain risks which are different in different countries. The risks depend on what are you financing. So how can you sort of model that? So standard is the wrong word, but methodological approach. Then also addressing the exchange rate risk is another factor. Then getting more data transparency is another key factor. We need to have the data. Data is key for financing. Financiers won't go anywhere if there's no transparency, no data. So data and also knowledge sharing is the third one, what we're going to look at. And then just catalyzing and involving more local guarantee mechanisms. So that's the guarantee side. Obviously, we have been using for a long time with many partners the instruments of blended finance vehicles, different funds we're working with there with many partners. And then we have I don't know if this is still working. Yeah, okay, thank you. So also looking at vehicles to address exchange rates through our International Climate Initiative. Yeah, and then, but the main thing is also addressing or convincing our public that climate finance invested not only at home, but everywhere is something that we need to do for our common good. Because and this isn't easy in these times where everyone is fixated very much on security, different aspects of security, but income security, energy security, national security. So how can we need climate security too, and investment and financing, public financing, mobilizing capital that makes or helps us generate climate security.
Yeah. And we were at a roundtable with the City of London types earlier, and Tatiana was there too, and the amount of interest in development finance guarantees from the private sector and some of the barriers to it is astounding, and I do think we're going to see a trend in that direction. So I really look forward to your report. So Tatiana, we'll come to you last, and because I don't know if you've got a hard deadline, I'm going to ask you two questions at once, and you can take as long as you need to answer them. And Shahjahan, I know you might need to leave, so if Shahjahan leaves, you haven't said anything to offend him. So firstly, you'll be working on the Baku to Belém roadmap this year, which I think most people, if you're attending a climate finance session, you're probably familiar with. This is a sort of idea that you need to pull forward a vision on how the world is going to mobilize the $1.3 trillion to developing economies by 2035 and how we can get on a pathway to that now. I wondered if you could say a few more words about your work there and just let us know your priorities and how people in this room can engage. And then secondly, if I may, and we heard from Rihanna Marie just before you got to the room, the work that the GFI is doing with Brazil and the UK on country platforms working with the World Bank to make sure they're private sector ready. But Brazil has been a leader in country platforms too, and BNDES as a national bank is doing fantastic work. Could you also talk a little bit around the Brazilian context and the work that you're trying to do over the course of this year? So we're technically at time, but I think every session today has run over, so take as long as you need or have.
Thank you. Thank you for bearing with me also, because I was very late, but I still could listen to some of our panelists. It's a pleasure to be here again. I was here also yesterday, but today I think we have a little more time.
Just in time.
To go, you know, the $1.3 trillion question, unfortunately, it is one question, but it doesn't have one, you know, answer or silver bullet, right? We don't have. So what we have been doing, and within the context of, there is a specific, we are leading the work of the Circle of Finance Ministers for COP30. So at the invitation of COP30 presidency, and with the aim of facilitating the work of both the specific task of by the NCQG decision of COP29 and COP2030 together to work on the roadmap. And we are doing it by, so I think one word on why, the specifics of the Circle of Finance Ministers. Why Circle of Finance Ministers? We were talking about climate, and I think it's a long, already, discussed topic that, we have to really mainstream climate in macroeconomic policy, and by the way, in all policies. This is the challenge. If we don't align, we will not, really get to where we want. If we don't have the right incentives externally and also domestically. And in the last years, there has been growing involvement of the ministers of finance and also like central banks, I would say, but. And in particularly, in last year, we have worked at the G20 presidency with, some important initiatives like the TF Clima, where we had the Sherpa tracks, the ambition of the climate, negotiators, and the finance track coming with the means to get us to these ambitions. We already had actually a COP30 in mind, so we were lucky to have, the G20 and the COP30 this year, and then have been able to work with partners. And this is important because a lot of the levers that we have to pull for climate finance, they are within the hands of finance ministries or regulators, right? So we have, and more than that, I have been really trying to emphasize the issue that it's really, we are talking about, it is a, civilization, human, it's a great challenge for human civilization, climate, but it's also, especially in terms of allocation of resources, it is a problem for also economics in its broadest sense, I think, the greatest challenge that we have, faced. We have to think it in terms of growth. Mafalda has already put it, I think, in a very, good way, that this is also, it's the case, it's because it's good for everyone if we actually have flows of $1.3 trillion to EMDEs, because that's where also we'll have the largest emissions and the largest, opportunities for investment, and because that's where we have the largest growth of population. So there is no much point in having, only, working on emissions elsewhere if you don't do that. But the good news also is that, this is a true case for investment, right? And also the Global South has the greatest potential, perhaps, that it has had, in decades or centuries, really, to have, to leapfrog, I think, for the new technologies. But of course, it's a very complex issue that you would take, that there are other issues that are not very much on the table that are also important for us to make this happen. For example, trade. It's not much on the table, but it's very, crucial also, because once you get the flows and, those, the countries that are there, they, part of they will do is also, for example, export and import. So if we don't have the whole architecture right, but since we cannot do everything at the same time, we have chosen 5 priorities. So these levers, the 5, first, we continue on the reforms of MDBs. Right? They are at the center of this because they can help us really, in really changing their model, having more, increasing their risk appetite, working better with their capital, including giving more guarantees, help us leverage the money or the very scarce money that we have. Then the second priority is the concession, expanding concessional finance, as difficult as it is, helping, Mafalda and the vertical climate funds to be able also to do, continue on their reforms, continue to improve their operations, improving accessibility, but also to be able to leverage more and to receive more resources if possible. And this is a very difficult, at this moment, as was also mentioned, a moment of challenge for everyone in terms of other priorities, in terms of securities and all that we have seen in declines in intentions for ODA. Now, the third is really something that Dr. Vera mentioned, domestic, strengthening domestic institution. Not that we are accounting for the domestic resource mobilization, that is not aim of the 1.3, but really in that this needs to be there, because it's very important that we also, work on that in terms of, fiscal policies, fiscal and tax policies, deepening capital markets, also national development institutions, to partner with also MDBs and the funds because they know better the risks of the local markets, and country platforms. Because country platforms, they have been, more and more emerging as one very important tool for us to really help countries. Call it as you wish. Some countries are building country platforms. Some others may choose other vehicles, but we need to translate the broad development strategies, climate and economic strategies, economic development strategies into NDCs and in investable opportunities. And we think some country platforms and country is important there because we're still talking about national strategies. That's why it's country platforms. And if we can really connect and align the NDCs then with the projects that go into these platforms, this will help us in this effort. And then the platforms could be vehicles where you could connect then this with the MDBs, the vertical climate funds, and the private sector to help us do the blended finance in a more also efficient way to use the scarce resources. And then fourth, the private capital mobilization. It's also, all the priorities are very interconnected. We cannot think of one without the other, right? So private capital mobilization also depends on new instruments, but it depends, it could gain a lot from so not only improving and scaling up new instruments and like, not, let's say, new, but maybe innovative in the way that we do them, like guarantees, and new first loss guarantee, securitization mechanisms. There are very good proposals on the table so that we can better let financial institutions, including MDBs, securitize their assets, free their capital to lend more, but also to maybe tailor instruments like for example, for institutional investors that they're more risk averse. They would like to buy more, sort of easier, simple instruments. And finally, also the regulatory, issues with going, pushing ahead, like interoperability of taxonomies for aligning flows, also the carbon markets, continue the work that has been done globally and nationally, including for compliance markets, and prudential and supervision legislation. Last word, I've spoken too much on the country platforms I mentioned already, and we are calling the Brazil platform that we launched last year at the annual meetings with the help of GCF. It was crucial, and other partners, as GFANZ also and others, and as you mentioned, also the GF to help us build this. But it's very much based on these principles of country ownership, of connectivity, flexibility, and translating our national climate plans into these investable opportunities. And so it has already over 15 projects with over 22 billion in investments that we are trying to, basically de-risk. Those are mostly, we put there the innovative technologies where we need their higher risk. And this is, I think it could also be an inspiration for other countries. We are very much hoping to also showcase these efforts and also partner with those that want. Thank you.
Thank you. It's almost like everything you're trying to achieve in the roadmap in microcosm, so all of these interconnected things coming together. We've had a really wonderful panel, expertise from across the finance value chain. Maybe not an MDB, that's one, so we'll have to find one at some point, but everyone else, please give a round of applause to our panel, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.